The birth, survival, twilight, and ultimate demise of divine beings seems to follow its own evolutionary patterns, such that some gods endure without significant cultic or theological change for centuries, while others blaze onto the world stage only to burn themselves up into extinction almost as soon as they appeared. Indeed, a given god must perform a careful balancing act to persist much through human time, marked by seemingly unending upheavals. On the one hand, a divine being must have a definite enough quality to attract and maintain worshippers, and yet, at the same time, such a god cannot be so rigid or its cult so conservative that it cannot endure significant adaptation and change, the only surety of our mundane world. Too far in one direction makes a god unappealing. Too far in the other dooms them given religious fashion and change, frankly. And surely, through the eons, some gods have adapted and many gods have gone extinct. Though one god has proven to be rather successful, oddly enough, not that that makes them a better god or even a real god, beyond all reasonable historical expectation. In fact, this god, whose simple name means something like the one that exists, emerged from the sands of Bronze Age obscurity to eventually become not just a national god, but, in the end, simply the god for the overwhelming majority of the world's population now. But just how did a tribal warrior storm god, Yahweh, go from being a god, a minor god among gods much more ancient and much more powerful, enduring up till then at least, to simply becoming God, the sole god of all that is in the mythology of billions? If you're interested in magic and hermetic philosophy, alchemy, or Kabbalah, or the history of the occult, make sure to subscribe and check out my other topics on contents and esotericism. And also, if you want to support my work of providing accessible, scholarly, and free content on topics here in esotericism, here on YouTube, freely accessible, I'd hope you consider supporting my work on Patreon, or with a one-time donation, with a super thanks option, or perhaps you'd buy a shirt over at our merch store on the channel. But now, let's turn to a god that all of us know of, but none of us really know much about. Yahweh, or the one that exists, the deity at the core of the Abrahamic faiths and beyond. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. As you might imagine, this is an episode I've been wanting to make for a long time, and I've been absolutely dreading having to make it for even longer. The importance of an episode on Yahweh is basically self-evident, but the challenges to making it should be equally self-evident. The literature on this topic is vast, utterly vast. It's spread over a dozen or so languages, performed by ingenious specialists with an encyclopedic grasp of the material, and yet an entire argument or series of arguments can hinge on a single suffix of an inscription. I'm looking at you, Kuntilich, a Druid pronomial suffix problem. And, of course, with Yahweh being at the core of the Abrahamic religions, historicizing such a being can easily be taken as an assault on the very core of those religions. If you historicize Yahweh, everything else might just disappear into the air. And yet, that's the task at hand. So it should go without saying that virtually everything I'm going to say in this episode can and would be taken to task by an army of specialists, and can in no way taken to be definitive, because there is simply that little consensus among the specialists. But I'd rather hazard an episode on the topic than just throw my hands up and say, oh, it's utterly frustrated by the difficulty and the complicatedness and the specialization of the topic. Better, as that famous saying of Beckett goes, ever tried, ever failed, no matter. Try again, fail better. So here's to failing better in the name of public education. Also, on a personal note, using the name Yahweh is just simply an academic attempt to vocalize the name of the Israelite tribal god, and not some attempt to actually utter a magical divine name, much less take such a name in vain. In fact, public education is just about the furthest thing from my mind when I think about doing something in vain. And lastly, this is an academic channel, and I check my religious commitments at the door, and historical facts and evidence are what matter here, not my personal beliefs. And really, when we allow our faith to dictate our history, we really just betrayed both. I guess I'll just come out of the gate with it. The origins of Yahweh are utterly unknown. The name may appear first in the 14th century BCE of an enemy list of Amenhotep III, in a similar but later list in the 13th century BCE by Ramses II as the Shasu of Yahweh, or the Shasu of Yahu. It's not quite clear how that was pronounced. The Shasu were semi-nomadic pastoralists, typically associated with raiding and general big brigandry. The Egyptian name for their name actually indicates their nomadic existence, to roam about, while the name taken up into Semitic and Hebrew means something like to raid or to plunder. So there's a clue what they were. While the name Yahweh does seem to appear here, it also seems to be functioning primarily as a toponym rather than as a theonym. But that other Shasu in the list are also associated with the region of Seir, it's a mountain range in the southwestern Transjordan, is probably going to prove salient here in just a moment. Whether the Shasu were Proto-Israelites isn't clear, but it seems reasonable to think that there was probably some connection, and ditto with the Hyperu and the social then ethnic groups, the Hebrews, that began as a social group, not an ethnic group, who were also associated with brigandry. So this is a fun origin story. Israel first appears to enter history on the Merneptah stele. He's the son of Ramses II, like his 13th son, where he claims victory such that the Canaan has been plundered into every sort of woe. Ashkelon has been overcome. Gezer has been captured. Yanoam is made non-existent. Israel is laid waste and his seed is not. Huru is become a widow because of Egypt. It's perhaps worth mentioning here that the Egyptian determinative on Ashkelon, Yanoam, and Gezer indicate foreign city. This is the triple mountain determinative, whereas Israel has the foreign ethnic group determinative, though, to be sure, the use of determinatives by Egyptian scribes can be all over the place, kind of arbitrary. The southerly geographic placement may also be important, though. Note that the Israelites that Merneptah claims to annihilate aren't actually associated here with the Shasu, so that's interesting. And, of course, their god, the God of Israel, and none of these gods is mentioned here. The first historical archaeological link between Israel and Yahweh as a god dates to much, much later in the Iron Age, where the 9th century BCE Mesha Stele, Victory Stele, brags of dragging vessels of Yahweh before Chemosh as the Moabite kingdom rebelled and escaped Amorite Israelite hegemony in the region. Thus, it seems that southern Levantine nomads and raiders were associated with Yahweh, perhaps as a kind of theological toponym, and that by the 13th century BCE, an ethnic group known as Israel, at least to the Egyptians, existed in a similar area, and that by the 9th century BCE, the Israelite house of Omri seems to have had Yahweh as an important, probably as their national god, as opposed to the Moabite Chemosh, before which those vessels, the aforementioned vessels, were dragged. Now, given the paucity of the archaeological record, which is basically that, what can we glean from our other surviving body of evidence, that is to say, Israelite literature as edited and compiled into the Hebrew Bible about the origins of Yahweh, or what we might call primitive Yahwism, or the cult of Yahweh before its assimilation into the Canaanite heartland, the Canaanite cult, and the Canaanite pantheon more generally. Now, to do this, it appears that the best methodology would be to take the earliest linguistic strata of the Israelite literature as it appears in the Hebrew Bible, especially the Song of the Sea at Exodus 15, 1 through 18, Judges 5, or Devorah's Song, Psalms 18, 29, 68, Genesis 49, among other scattered memories of very linguistically archaic mentions of Yahweh and his cult. From this, a rough sketch of primitive Yahweh can be made. It appears that the deity's original heartland was Seir, Edom, Teman, with Mount Sinai actually probably originally lying in that region. Recall the Shasu of Seir earlier. That is to say, the northwestern Arabian Peninsula, just east of the Dead Sea. It appears that Yahweh was probably originally a warrior god, perhaps associated with raiding and women warband prophets. Further, the central manifestation of Yahweh seems to have been storms, specifically the catastrophic thunderstorms that result in the deadly flash flooding, which actually plagues that region down to this day. Petra, the same region where Yahweh may have come from, was engineered around managing just those thunderstorms. Oh, and you can see video of what those flash floods look like in that region, and they are terrifying. At some point in the late Bronze, or probably the early Iron Age, the Yahweh cult made its way into the Judean highlands, likely settling at a cult center in Shiloh. This corresponds roughly to the biblical period of the Judges. The nomadic and possibly mercantile nature, note the mention of caravans in the Song of Devorah, which is, by the way, probably the earliest text in the Hebrew Bible, of primitive Yahwists might explain the diffusion of the cult. That is to say, it was spread through mercantile trade. This diffusion is probably overdetermined, however, especially if raiding were involved. Of course, the major historical backdrop of all of this is the Bronze Age collapse. Through the 13th century BCE, civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean experienced a cascading systems collapse. Real scary, resulting in mass migration from the Aegean, i.e. the sea peoples, imperial border regression and local hegemony collapse on the part of the various empires, especially the Egyptians, imperial collapse, just full-blown civilization collapse for the Hittites and the city-state of Gerar, and generalized urban disintegration, note at a site like the city of Gezer. In fact, it may be that the conditions of the Bronze Age collapse allowed for the power vacuum in which one, raiding as a means of survival would have emerged, and a raiding cult headed by a warrior raiding god like Yahweh might have proven pretty popular in the chaos. I mean, imagine what kind of religions would emerge in the world of Mad Max or something like that. Though this is just speculation, and that disruption in the Bronze Age collapse is probably what allowed the various states to revolt, resulting in Merneptah putting them down. But also, especially the collapse of Egyptian hegemony in the region, and this is very important. This would have allowed de facto independence, especially in the Canaanite highlands, because who wants to go up there? And it isn't surprising to me that Yahweh's cult and its military, political, state-building wing would settle in relatively remote Shiloh before spreading north and south into the highlands and then pushing west down into the Shphelah to contest eventually with the Sea People, who also got a foothold in former territory of Egyptian hegemony. This, of course, is the Peliset, as we know them from the Egyptian literature or from the Bible as well. You guessed it, the Philistines. Thus, by Iron I, or roughly around 1200 to 1000 BCE, Yahweh had probably come to settle in the Canaanite highlands, thus marking the end of primitive Yahwism and the beginning of an incredibly complex process by which elements of Canaanite religious and cultic systems would be negotiated with both the cult, but also the very divine person of Yahweh through a process of theological convergence and assimilation, divergence and cultic antagonism, and especially early monarchic syncretism. To appreciate this process, it's best to explore this complex dialectic on two axes, one being the Canaanite pantheon itself, but the other being the progression through time from the period of the Judges and through the monarchy's complex cultic relationships marked by syncretism in the north primarily, but more punctuated by Yalu monolatry in the south before the eventual transition to monotheism in the exilic and really the post-exilic period. So let's begin by exploring the dynamics of theological convergence and divergence, or cultic antagonism, with the Canaanite pantheon and Yahweh. Most of our knowledge of the Canaanite pantheon stems from the discoveries of vast royal libraries of the city of Ugarit, another victim of the Bronze Age collapse. What has emerged from this center are significant collections of mythological and cultic documents, deeply detailing the nature, personalities, and mythic deeds of the various Canaanite gods in that pantheon. Though two caveats are perhaps in order. The first is that this trove may represent a specifically royal, specifically Ugaritic expression of the Canaanite theology and its myth cycles. The second is that these documents date to the mid-12th century at the latest. The city itself was probably destroyed around 1185 BCE, which is hundreds of years and still quite a distance away from the locus classicus of the development of the Israelite cult down a good bit southerly in the highlands. Thus, we don't know to what degree the Canaanite cult expressed itself specifically in that region, down in the highlands, and this is especially true because the Canaanite written record in that area is remarkably poor. It's basically non-existent. So, to what degree can we take the Ugaritic text to be representative of Southern Highlander cult? Not clear. But those caveats aside, the head of the Canaanite pantheon was the grandfatherly god El, simply God. Indeed, some theories actually have that Yahweh was a local, very far southern manifestation of El, but I think that's probably doubtful. Though Deuteronomy 39 seems to be an archaic recall when Elyon, a manifestation of El, parceled out the world, providing Yahweh specifically with the lands of Jacob Israel. This is probably a rare survival from a period where Yahweh was still kind of subservient to Elyon and before theological convergence with El more generally. However, it's clear that the Yahwists were pretty comfortable enough with El to allow for significant amounts of assimilation of El features onto Yahweh, even when those features perhaps stood in significant contrast to the strident warrior of the primitive cult. One of the more striking features of these is the assimilation of El as an elderly, wise god. El is known as the father of years in the Ugaritic myth cycles, and it's perhaps this image of an elderly, white-bearded deity as assimilated onto Yahweh from Canaanite El that has probably proved the most visibly enduring in popular perception and art. If you imagine an old bearded dude as God, you're imagining El. Attached to this elder character is also El's wisdom, a trait not typically associated again with a warrior god. They don't need to be wise or smart. Further, Yahweh's partially converged as a creator deity, but only partially converged. The name Yahweh probably just meant the one that is, or he is, and was primitively not associated with creative powers. Again, warrior gods don't do much creating stuff. And the verbal form to twist his name, Yod He Vav He, into a creative form, the verbal form that we know as the Hifil in Hebrew, it never appears in Israelite literature. Thus, it's unsurprising that a great deal of the creative work in the Bible is typically associated with the divine names like El, and especially Elohim. Even note a name like Elkanah, El creates, never really appears with a Yahwistic theoform. We never get a Yahwistic version of that name. Thus, we have a situation where not only are elements of El assimilated to Yahweh, but that the early Israelites were even comfortable enough with a theological identity made between the two. They combine El and Yahweh. It's very clear in the Hebrew Bible. Thus, many elements of Canaanite El, though not all of them, definitely not all of them as we'll see in a moment, are assimilated to Yahweh, or, with the identity being established, the powers and features of El de facto become those of Yahweh. An element of this transfer, especially in the earlier period, was El's divine council, including a retinue of quasi-divine bureaucrats such as the prosecuting attorney Ha-Satan, but also the military leader, the Sar Tzava, but also including the 70 sons of El, or Elyon. Of course, these sons would also later become demoted to angels as monotheism took root before descending to earth to mate with human women in Genesis 6, and all that gets developed, of course, in the book of Enoch. Though, like creation, this assimilation of the divine council was not total. The sons always appear as sons of El, the divine appellation there, never the sons of Yahweh. Though, along with these originally quasi-divine beings would also come an entire retinue of celestial objects, because the sky, especially things like stars, the sun, and the moon, that were all worshipped in the region as well. One of those beings, Halel ben Shachar, probably Venus, appears in the divine council as a kind of insurgent upstart cast down to Canaanite Sheol, the underworld of the Israelites, and an oracle against a king of Babylon, probably Nebuchadnezzar. Of course, this character would later go on to become modified in Christian mythology to become the satanic Lucifer in that tradition, showing just how long of a half-life these beings can have. That being goes all the way back to ancient Canaanite celestial mythology. Another interesting instance has a deceptive spirit, a Ruach Sheker, being recruited by Yahweh to fool some of the prophets to ensure the death of King Achav. Of course, Psalm 82 also captures this assimilation of El's divine council very clearly. He's speaking to members of the divine council, they're called gods. Perhaps the most peculiar assimilation of this to the warrior god Yahweh are actually El's traits as merciful and compassionate. This is an outstanding trait and sensible for the grandfatherly El, who even has a bit too much to drink from time to time. There are some great stories in the Ugaritic myth cycles about that. And it is an interesting but reasonable assimilation onto a god whose prehistory of warfare and brutal raiding must transition. It has to transition when you go into a more sedentary cult where, you can't solve all your problems through violence anymore, even most of your problems through violence. Thus, this results in contemporary readers' whiplash reading the Hebrew Bible, where the deity there seems to absolutely delight in wading in blood of his foes and killing people, and then you turn a few pages later, and this is a God whose mercy and compassion never fail. That's because you have two gods being welded together here who have very different traits. Of course, not all elements of Yahweh were assimilated equally by the Israelites. One of the important epithets of El was Bull El, and bull iconography, eventually all iconography, especially in the South, was apparently polarizing among the Israelites. It appears that the northern variants of the cult accepted El Yahweh bull iconography, with Jeroboam I setting up very distinct bull imagery at his Yahweh shrines at Bethel. The name there, House of El, and Dan. Dan is the only surviving Yahweh shrine in the world, from antiquity at least, along with Tel Arad in the south, but it's mostly been deconstructed and put in the Israel Museum. These are the only two Yahweh shrines that survive into the archaeological record. Now, while this bull imagery might have been primitive to Yahweh, it's much more likely that it was a northern assimilation from the El cult, that the southern cult, by the way, preferring the ark's cherubim as its major cult symbol, but it was actually just more generally aniconic in its disposition, generally grew to detest, especially as the northern kingdom grew in power and prestige, and, well, the Amorites were very powerful, and the southerners probably felt jealous of them and hated their cows. Indeed, the golden calf narrative itself may be a southern polemic against the Norse assimilation of this dimension of El's cult, the importation of this bull imagery. Finally, El had a divine consort, Atherat, but I'll come back to her when I discuss Asherah in just a moment. If the relationship of Yahweh and El was assimilation to convergence, then the relationship with the Canaanite warrior and storm god Baal, literally the Lord, is going to be characterized by assimilation to not only divergence, but also just straight up cultic antagonism. The discovery of the Ugaritic Baal cycle has done more to inform our understanding of the local ancient mythology of that region than perhaps any other group of texts outside, of course, from the Hebrew Bible. Here, Baal is famous for his triumphs over the chaotic forces of the sea, or Yam, his fight with death, to the death, when he subsequently resurrected and achieved detente with Mot, or the god of death, with the aid of the fierce fertility warrior goddess Anat, thus providing for the life-giving winter rains in the region before being exalted as virtually the king of the entire world. Virtually every element of the Baal cultus will intersect with Yahweh and his cult, very probably because of just how similar the deities were and how very popular Baal must have been compared with the relative upstart Yahweh in the region. As I mentioned, both gods were associated with storms, especially for their life-giving rains in the region. However, they're both associated with storms of very different kinds. Yahweh was likely associated with the terrifying thunderstorms and flash floods of the southern Arava regions, whereas Baal was associated primarily with the coastal winter storms, without which the arid region would struggle to bloom. Both storm gods, very different kinds of storms. However, as Yahweh settled into the region, the motif of him as a rider upon the clouds, one virtually shared with Baal, would be extended not just to the thunderstorms of the south, but also to the coastal rains as well. This element becomes assimilated easily onto Yahweh. Numerous evidence of these storm theophanies abound, though Psalm 29 conforms so much with Baal imagery that some scholars have just kind of argued that it's a literal Yahweh for Baal substitution hymn. It's like cut and paste Yahweh for Baal, though it's a little simplistic. Further, elements of Baal's contest with the sea, or Yam and its dragon Lotan, are mirrored in early Israelite Yahwism, with a similar contest, most notably in the third creation story of the Bible, found in Psalm 74, and of course in Job, where the defeat of sea monsters, specifically Leviathan, were a necessary aspect of forging the world from watery chaos to order. This is a pretty common myth cycle in the ancient Near East. Ironically, this defeat of Leviathan would be later transposed into a world-ending apocalypse in later mutations of the myth, both in Judaism and in Christianity. Further, Baal contest with death, or Mot, is often just demythologized in general, such that Yahweh has control over both life and death, and in some passages, Yahweh is even described as swallowing up death. This is a very big flex, an ironic flex, over Yahweh's power over life and death, because it's exactly death that's described in Ugaritic myth as having a gaping maw. It does the swallowing, not gods. Further, the dwelling place of Baal on Mount Zaphon, modern-day Jebel Akra, became metonymized into Hebrew as just the word for north, with Yahweh also primitively associated with mountains, especially Sinai Moriah. The title El Shaddai probably is just another reference to how a mountain El is assimilated over to Yahweh from the Akkadian word for mountain. Though eventually Mount Zion is eventually going to be substituted out for Mount Zaphon for pride of place, but the metonymy, Zaphon as the word for north, it continues into Hebrew to this very day. Of course, with both being warrior and storm gods, it's unsurprising that Yahweh would be pitted against Baal in cultic combat. This needs to be a video game. Baal's popularity can be seen in the numerous, over a dozen theonomic place names associated with him. These are probably local manifestations of Baal, akin to the way that Roman gods were locally manifest, or even the way you get sort of avatars of Mary in various places, Our Lady of so-and-so. And further, the horror Baal's worship seems to have inspired in certain Israelite writers and prophets. And further, it's also pretty clear that in at least the first half of the monarchy, there was a pretty strong attempt to syncretize Yahweh-Baal worship, which seems reasonable, with Baal cultic objects placed in otherwise specifically Yahwistic shrines, probably to please both the local population, but also the exogamous wives for whom Baal was the central native god in their religion. The Israelites would marry outside of the Israelite group in order to basically secure international relationships like everyone else. Thus, this was very likely an attempt to assimilate Baal to Yahweh, just as with El in the north. However, the southern cult was never quite this comfortable, and purges by several southern kings, such as by Hezekiah, Jehu, and most famously Josiah, sought to completely deracinate non-Yahweh worship and even non-Jerusalemite Yahweh worship. They didn't even want you worshiping Yahweh somewhere else. However, it appears that by the 8th century BCE that the Israelite prophets, such as Elijah and Elisha, really rejected any form of syncretism, and the narrative describes multiple contest-like ordeals between the Israelite Yahweh partisans and the Baal cult and the Asherah cult, especially as backed by Ahab and his Phoenician wife Jezebel, who gets an unwarrantedly evil reputation. You can hear, by the way, the Baal theonym in her name. In fact, the scribes of the Hebrew Bible so hated Baal that theonymics employing his name underwent taboo replacement with the Hebrew word for shame, boshet. Thus, names like Esh-Baal become Esh-Boshet, Meri-Baal become Meri-Boshet. Even the goddess Astarte becomes Ashtoreth, using the vowel pattern from the word for shame to muck about with her name. Further, the phrase Prince Baal or Baal Zebul famously becomes Baal Zebub, the Lord of the Flies, and even Daniel's term for the abomination of desolation, Shikutzma Shomeim, may become actually a pun on Baal Shemen, or Baal of the heavens, thus that the heavenly is thrown down. Thus, Baal and Yahweh are probably mutual victims of what Freud called the narcissism of minor difference. They're just that similar. The stage of ancient Canaan and ancient Israel just being, well, too small for two warrior storm gods, and with only a minor exception, Baal basically vanishes from the religious record in Canaan by the post-exilic period. Though, of course, Baal would go on to continue to function in the Phoenician deity system as Melkart as late as the rise of Christian hegemony in the late classical period. So, one god had to go, and at least in that region, it ended up being Baal. Though, while not directly bearing on the development of Yahweh as a god, but more so on Yahwism as a cult, is the question of how El's consort, Therat, would or would not be incorporated. Asherah, she appears in the Hebrew, is mentioned some 40 times throughout the Hebrew Bible, though overwhelmingly in reference to a kind of wooden ritual pole that probably represents a sacred tree of fertility, which in turn, of course, represents the goddess herself. Though there are a couple times where she's mentioned as a Pesel Asherah set up by Menashe. This is probably an engraved representation of her, maybe like those ones from the Bronze Age of her cupping her breasts, though we don't know. Unsurprisingly, the cult of Asherah was very popular, and it seems reasonable for many reasons. Fertility is popular. That Yahweh-El assimilation convergence would also result in consort exchange, such that El Athirat would become Yahweh Asherah, and that seems to be precisely what happened. Though, of course, not without some hella theological controversy. Several Israelite and Judean kings seem to have placed her cultic symbol in Yahweh temples, and equally stridently, Elijah contested with her prophets and the prophets of Baal and murdered them all, at least according to the text, and Josiah targeted her cult in his Inquisition reforms. Indeed, it's the Deuteronomists, particularly, that have the most deeply concerned worries about the elimination of her cult. Her exact status in this period is contested, while the two famous inscriptions at Kuntalit Adrud and Khirbet El Qom seem to indicate that her status was as consort of Yahweh, despite that pesky pronomial suffix, which no one quite seems to know just what to do with, and there is 50,000 volumes on that. One pronomial suffix. The overwhelming concern about her is the adoration of her cult object itself, especially in Yahweh shrines. They may have been okay with Yahweh having a wife, but not her cult object in the same shrine. While we have to acknowledge the paucity of evidence here, it seems reasonable to me that she did function as Yahweh's consort, but that this El assimilation was heavily theologically contested, especially in the South with the more emergent Yahweh monolaters. The cult object probably represented the goddess. That seems almost ipso facto true. It clearly became associated with Yahweh. The Deuteronomists constantly complain about it, and the logic of El convergence seems likely that the two were conceived together, despite, again, the general aniconic and Yahweh monolatry parties eventually that would emerge and obtain cultic hegemony, especially in the South. Now, to what degree Asherah and Astarte Ishtar were assimilated during this period is unknown. The answer is probably maybe. And further, there's a vague reference to a being called the Queen of Heaven, very disdained by Jeremiah. Who this is also unknown. Though the term for the cakes that are offered to the Queen of Heaven in that text there are actually Akkadian loanwords. They're coming over from the Akkadian language. So it seems like a nod in the direction of Ishtar Astarte assimilation, but we don't know. With the exception of a few names, especially in very archaic sources, there in the Song of Devorah, the fertility and warrior goddess Anat seems to play basically little to no role in this period of the development of Yahwism, and maybe just in the whole cultic environment of Canaan. Though the bloodshed imagery associated with Ugaritic Anat, her wading through blood and gore and decapitated heads rolling about her feet and dismembered hands flying into the air about her like locusts. This needs to be a metal song. Why isn't there a metal band called Anat? You see very similar kinds of depictions of Yahweh delighting in warfare and carnage in the Song of Devorah, but honestly, I would just suspect that primitive Yahweh and Anat actually would just have made a better couple than Yahweh and Asherah, given their proclivity to massacring people. You get kind of natural-born killer vibes from that couple. But I suspect the similarities are probably just endemic to ancient total warfare, hacking people to death on the battlefield, than any actual theological convergence or assimilation between Yahweh and Anat. Of course, Yahwism would undergo further assimilation to Canaanite mythology, especially the demythologizing of the plague gods Resheph and Dever, literally burning and plague, terrifying gods who come to serve as nightmarish steeds pulling the divine chariot. That is an image in the Hebrew Bible, more metal. Or the literary transfer of the mighty regal dead of the Raphauma of the Ugaritic mythology to the Rephaim as giants defeated by biblical figures as a show of force in the Hebrew Bible. In fact, I've done an entire episode tracing out just the development and history of the Rephaim from ancient Canaanite into ancient Israelite mythology if you want to check it out. That's a fascinating development with the Rephaim. All in all, what we have is a complex, non-linear process whereby primitive Yahwism and Yahweh become implanted into the post-Bronze Age collapse of the area of the Canaanite Israelite highlands, becoming the chief, though not the sole god of the emergent Israelites. Again, this is the famous henotheism of the period, and he becomes a core aspect of their emergent national hegemony in the region. The earlier period is marked by theological convergence and divergence, assimilation and conflict, all with the local Canaanite cults and their gods, with a tendency towards syncretism in originally the more affluent northern areas, but this earns the ire of both the southern Yahweh partisans who may have been already on the path or developing in the direction of monolatry and anaconism, along with a small fraction of northern prophet shamans. With the destruction of the north in 722 BCE, the northern Yahwist refugees would be absorbed into the more anti-syncretistic, anaconic, and Yahweh monolatrous southern cult. This would develop in fits and starts until the rule of Josiah and the Deuteronomists, whose reforms, or better inquisition, not only sought out to eliminate non-Yahweh worship from this kingdom, but also non-Jerusalemite Yahweh worship. Again, theology and politics are the same thing here, and centralizing one centralizes the other by necessity. Hence the destruction of even Yahweh shrines in the region, like that one that was torn down there at Tel Arad. With the 6th century BCE exile of the Judean elites, who were probably majority Yahweh monolaters or even early monotheists maybe, the theology of the exile and the post-exile would represent a massive shift from a parochial Judean god to a singular cosmic god with a clear expression of monotheism first emerging in texts like Trito Isaiah. Monotheism would mark the post-exilic period, Yahwism went into exile, Judaism came back. And that's a point I'd like to drive home. In my mind, the transition to the universal monotheism of Judaism would come at a price, and that price would be the particularism of Yahweh as Yahweh. Far from the primitive warrior storm god of the desert wilds of the Arava, or even the quilted together deity forged in the religious crucible of contestation and assimilation of the period of the judges in the northern and southern kingdoms, the theological tension would now be between the god of Judaism as a people, both sovereign and diasporic, with a truly universal being transcending all differences, responsible for even the cosmos itself, even abstracted to utter transcendence by both apocalyptic mysticism and Hellenistic philosophy. The distinction now would be, what kind of universal God are you going to get? A parochial Judean one or a more philosophical abstract one? And it would be the promise of universal salvation, reserved once only for the Judeans, matched by this cosmic apocalypticism and eschatological fervor in which Yahweh would become a father to a sacrificed son for the salvation of both Jew and Gentile. That would set the stage for the next part of this epic story, the transition of Yahweh from a Judean God to simply God for billions and billions of human beings. As I mentioned, the literature in this field is vast and highly technical. However, I'd like to recommend a few volumes if you want to dive deeper into this topic, and if this episode interests you, you need to by all means. The Early History of God and the Origins of Biblical Monotheism by Mark Smith is fantastic. John Day's Yahweh and the Gods and Gods of Canaan is a classic. Frank Moore Cross's Canaanite Myth and Hebrew Epic, along with The Religions of Ancient Israel by Tzioni Zevet, are all both and great. For a diplomatic history of Israel from a archaeological point of view, rather than just the text, the aptly named book by Dever, Beyond the Text, an archaeological portrait of ancient Israel and ancient Judah, is very diplomatic and a fine text. Although his book has archaeology buried the Bible, it's kind of like the too long didn't read it version of the book I just mentioned, so if you want to read another one, that one's a good one. It's kind of a digest of the more specialized text. Theodore Lewis's more recent The Origin and Character of God, Ancient Israelite Religion Through the Lens of Divinity, is also just a beast of a text, a magisterial approach, and well worth the effort. As I said, this episode is a testament to not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. This episode is incomplete. It goes way too fast over a lot of topics, and this could just be an entire semester class, at the very least, and require sophisticated knowledge of ancient Near East history and several ancient languages, not to mention just an encyclopedic grasp of the Hebrew Bible and Canaanite myth more generally. Despite the myriad shortcomings of this episode, I hope it's still useful for grasping at some level where scholars are on the mysterious origin and development of Yahweh, a God we all know, and yet we still have to admit we know so little of. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.